You're listening to TIP.
Hey, how's everybody doing out there? So this is our second part interview of the Berkshire Hathaway Shareholders meeting. Just so everyone understands how this happened. So whenever you're out in Omaha, the meeting's on a Saturday. And on that Saturday, you show up really ridiculously early. I want to say, some of us arrive slightly before 5 o'clock in the morning, just so we can get a good seat. And so you wait in line, you get into the stadium, this called the CenturyLink. And in the CenturyLink, there's 40,000 people that show up for this thing. And then you sit around and you listen to Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger answer a bunch of questions all morning and afternoon. So they usually start at 9 o'clock and they'll go till lunchtime. And so the questions that we played last week were the questions from that first section that happened between 9 o'clock and lunchtime. Then everyone goes and they take a quick break to eat lunch. They come back at 1 o'clock. And then they answer questions for another 2 hours until 3 p.m. in the afternoon. So these two, when you think about their age, they're, Buffett's in his 80s, Munger's in his 90s, and they're doing this for just countless amount of time. I couldn't imagine what it feels like for them to be answering this many questions. But today's episode, this is our second part interview of the Berkshire Hathaway Shareholders meeting. We're going to be playing questions that happened from 1 o'clock till 3 p.m. And we're just playing the questions that we think were the best. And then we're going to be providing our feedback. So we're looking forward to doing this.
In this episode, Warren Buffett will talk to us about how he thinks artificial intelligence will change Berkshire's business. We'll also hear from Charlie Munger why he's thinking that they would never ever have bought Precision Castparts just 10 years ago. Precision Castparts is a $32 billion deal that they did in 2015. You'll hear our take on his progression in his investment approach. What has changed? And what stays the same. Preston and I had so much fun recording this episode, and we really hope you enjoyed too.
You are listening to The Investors Podcast, where we study the financial markets and read the books that influence self-made billionaires the most. We keep you informed and prepared for the unexpected.
All right, so we're here back with you for the second part episode of our discussion with the Berkshire meeting. So we're going to go ahead and kick this off with the first question from the second half of the meeting.
This is a question from George Benaroya, and it adds a layer to the discussion about 3G a little bit ago. He says, I am a very happy long-term shareholder, but this is a concern I have regarding Berkshire Hathaway's Kraft Heinz investment. This investment has done well in economic terms. The carrying value is $15 billion and the market value was $28 billion in 2016. But the DNA of 3G is quite different from ours. We do not make money by buying companies and firing people. 3G fired 2,500 employees at Kraft Heinz. That is what private equity firms do, but we are not a private equity firm. Our values have worked for us for over 50 years. There is a risk that as 3G continues to deviate from our principles, they will eventually harm both our value and our values. How do we prevent that from happening?
Well, it's interesting. I mentioned earlier that it was very gradual, but it would have been probably a better decision. We fired 2,000 people over time, and some retired and left and all of that, at the textile operation. It didn't work. And Hochschild Kohn, the successor, fortunately sold it to somebody else, but eventually they closed up the department stores because department stores, at least that particular one, and a good many actually, including our competitors in Baltimore, could not make it work. Walmart came along with something, and now Amazon's coming along with something that changed the way people bought things. We mentioned our poultry, the CTB, which is a lot of different farm equipment. The farm equipment, often, that CTB develops, the idea is that it's more productive than what already is out there, which means fewer people are employed on farms. We had 80% of the American population, working population, working on farms a couple of hundred years ago. And if nobody had come up with things to make it more productive, farming, we'd have 80% of people working on farms now to feed our populace, and it means that we'd be living in a far, far more primitive way. So if you look at the auto industry, it gets more productive. If you look at any industry, they're trying to get more productive. Walmart was more productive than department stores, and that will continue in America, and it better continue, or our kids won't live any better than we do. Our kids will live better than we do because America does get more productive as it goes along, and people do come up with better ways of doing things. When Kraft Heinz finds that they can do whatever amount of business, $27 billion worth of business or something, and they can do it with fewer people, they are doing what American business has done for a couple hundred years and why we live so well, but they do it very fast. They are more than fair in terms of severance pay and all of that sort of thing, but they don't want to have two people doing the job that one can do. And I frankly don't like going through that, having faced that. I faced that down at Dempster in Beatrice, Nebraska. And it really needed change. But the change is painful for a lot of people. And I just would rather spend my days not doing that sort of thing, having had one or two experiences. But I think that it's absolutely essential to America that we become more productive, because that is the only way we have more consumption per capita, is have more productivity per capita. Charlie?
Well, you're absolutely right. We don't want to go back to subsistence farming. I had a week of that when I was young on a western Nebraska farm, and I hated it. And I don't miss the elevator operators who used to sit there all day in the elevator and run the little crank, So, on the other hand, as you say, it's terribly unpleasant for the people that have to go through it. And why would we want to get into the business of doing that over and over ourselves? We did it in the past when we had to, when the businesses were dying. I don't see any moral fault in 3G at all. But I do see that there's some political reaction that doesn't do anybody any good.
Milton Friedman, I think it was, used to talk about the time, probably apocryphal, the huge construction project in some communist country, and they had thousands and thousands and thousands of workers out there with shovels digging away on this major project. And then they had a few of these big earth-moving machines behind, which were idle, and which could have done the work in 1/20th of the time of the workers. So the economist suggested to the local party worker or whoever it was that, why in the world didn't they use these machines to get the job done in 1/10 or 1/20th the time instead of having all these workers out there with shovels? And the guy replied, well, yeah, but that would put the workers out of work. And Friedman said, well, then why don't you give them spoons to do it instead?
All right. So pretty interesting exchange here where it was quickly turned to a productivity discussion. And the person who was asking the question through Carol Loomis was implying that 3G isn't, and that's just for people know, for a little context, 3G is a multi-billion-dollar company that Berkshire often does deals with. I know whenever they did the Heinz deal, Berkshire took the preferred stock and 3G took a lot of the common stock. And then whenever they did that, they ended up firing, I guess the number was 2,000 employees in order to optimize operations. And so the person was saying, hey, if you keep doing business with this 3G capital from Brazil, I have concern as a shareholder of the ethics, I guess, behind this. And so Buffett quickly spun this into a productivity discussion of, if you're going to make business more productive into the future, how is that unethical? That's capitalism at its heart. So very interesting exchange. I agree with pretty much all of this. I think where this kind of becomes an interesting discussion for some people is when you look at how much consolidation has occurred over the last 100 years in the United States, where the people who own a majority of the equity are much, much smaller in number than where they were 100 years ago. And that consolidation continues to happen. And in that conversation where nothing took place and why you're seeing such a large movement in the United States, and I'm not saying either one of these are right, I'm just laying out another argument for people to think about. I think why you have so many people that are kind of up in arms about where the direction of where capitalism in general is going is because so much of that consolidation is happening with such a few amount of people relative to what it was 50 to 100 years ago. If I was going to pin something on why that's occurred, I think a lot of it's occurred just because there's been so much central bank manipulation for the last 100 years. And it has caused these major shifts recently. Like, let's just take the last business cycle, the last 10 years. You saw central banks paying pretty much any price to put cash into the market, and they were doing that by basically buying bonds off the market through quantitative easing. Well, that money, that cash is now being put in the hands of asset holders. And those asset holders now have cash in order to reinvest back into the market, which then takes more equity out of the hands of the majority. And so that discussion is something that was not addressed by Buffett and Munger. And I'm not saying that that's right or wrong. Please don't take anything that I'm saying here out of context. I guess what I'm trying to do is provide an argument to the other side of this that some people have in the world, and that would be it. So for me personally, I completely agree with Munger and Buffett. I really like Buffett's story there at the end with the spoons and the equipment. I think that that's just a brilliant way to look at things. And I think it really speaks to the true power of capitalism, and that you can't intertwine yourself into that. You have to kind of remove yourself from that and let the free market make things more efficient, make things more productive, so that our kids can have a better lifestyle than we have today.
I really liked how Buffett talked about his old purchase of Devster Mill. And the reason why he did that, back when it was in the 50s and 60s, when Buffett was in textile, which he quickly discovered was a horrible business. Well, one of the reasons why he realized that was that American businesses at that time simply became less and less competitive. So what he saw was that it was simply a matter of time before he eventually had to close it down. And what he talks about is that someone else came along and then they ultimately needed to close it. You know, you very often hear these arguments that, well, if you don't lay off people, you will probably just be, 1% less competitive. You would still be a profitable company. And that's clear that that would be true for Berkshire Hathaway. Following that approach, it will only be a question of time before it would be, 2% or 10% or 50% or whatever it is. So eventually, as you are progressing and you are being less and less productive, the company will ultimately shut down. And so what Buffett is really talking about is really to be on the forefront of that and saying, whether or not we like it, we need to respect capitalism and the rules that they're playing under. I definitely think that Buffett agrees with the rules, but even if he didn't, there's really no way around it. That is what he's saying. And another way we're celebrating Warren Buffett is also he's talking about how he can run his headquarters with 25 people. That's amazing, thinking about he has more than 100,000 employees. But you could also, again, revert the question and said, think about how many people that are not employed because he could hire 200 extra people in his headquarters. So I just think he's actually very, very honest. But obviously, as Preston was also getting at before, for the individual worker that's getting fired, this is not fun. He or she might not be able to retrain. So clearly that's a painful transition. But it is the way this is going, whether we like it or not.
Very interesting exchange. In fact, there was another point in the meeting where they were having more discussions about productivity, and both times were very interesting to hear their thoughts on it. And I think they're obviously very biased towards capitalism is good, which I'm a capitalist. Okay, just so people know who are listening to this, I am a capitalist. I completely agree with Buffett and Munger's opinion. I just like to lay out the other side of the argument so people that are listening to this just don't hear one side of it, and that they can make up their mind between hearing both sides. Let's go ahead and play the next question here.
This question is on Berkshire's intrinsic value. A substantial portion of the company's value is driven by operating businesses rather than the performance of the securities portfolio. Also, the values of previously acquired businesses are not marked up to their economic value, including Geico, Mid-American, and Burlington Northern. Based on these factors, is book value per share still a relevant metric for valuing Berkshire?
Well, it's got some relevance, but it's got a whole lot less relevance than it used to, and that's why I don't want to drop the book value per share factor, but the market value tends to have more significance as the decades roll along. It's a starting point, and clearly our securities aren't worth more than we're carrying them for at that time. And on the other hand, we've got the kind of businesses you mentioned, but we've got some small businesses that are worth 10 times or so, what would carry for. We've also got some clunkers too. But the best method, of course, is just to calculate intrinsic business value, but it can't be precise. We think the probability is exceptionally high that 120% understates it. Although if it was all in securities, 120% would be too high. But as the businesses have evolved, as we built in unrecognized value at the operating businesses, unrecognized for accounting purposes, I think it still has some use as being kind of the base figure we use. if it were a private company and 10 of us here owned it, instead we just sit down annually and calculate the businesses one by one and use that as a base value. But that gets pretty subjective when you get as many as we do. And so I think the easiest thing is to use the standards we're using now, recognizing the limitations in them. Charlie?
Yeah, I think that I basically like it when our marketable securities go down and our own businesses go up.
Yeah, we're working to that end. We've been working that way for 30 years now or something like that.
We've done a pretty good job, too.
Yeah.
We've replaced a lot of marketable securities with unmarketable securities that are worth a lot more.
Yeah, and it's actually a more enjoyable way to operate, too, beyond that. But,
yeah, we know a lot of people we wouldn't otherwise be with. Good people.
So that's such a funny exchange because it was basically their way of saying, yeah, we do stock picking, but we actually really prefer running operational businesses. And a lot of the stocks that we have owned, that we have sold, we've done much better with buying operational businesses that aren't publicly traded than keeping the publicly traded businesses on the stock market. I just love that because I think everyone really needs to listen to that and take away from that what it is, which is them saying they love being business owners. They love running operational businesses. They like that much more than stocks. I just find it so awesome.
If you actually look at the numbers, so the market cap for Berkshire Hathaway right now is around $400 billion. Only 160% of that is in the stock portfolio. The most significant part here, at least for me, is not their stock portfolio. And I also think that that is definitely what they're getting at. And Buffett even said that they spent 30 years having less and less marketable securities and then scaling up the operating businesses. That is what he wants to do. And clearly, this is also a question about how much capital you have. I mean, he started out more as a stock pick, which made a lot of sense because he started out with tens of thousands of dollars and not millions or billions of dollars. So it's really, really hard to control a company with that amount of capital. But that is basically what he wants to do. Also because he has such a great track record in terms of buying operating businesses that can run by himself. He's not using his bandwidth to manage them or his headquarters bandwidth. They're more or less operating on their own. And what he's also talking about, whenever he said, 1.2, that was the limit of when it would start to repurchase shares. Right now, Berkshire Hathaway is trading just short of 1.4. And he was also getting at whether or not he might increase that soon. So basically, he was also talking about like the economic value of companies that are not public companies might be worth more in value.
So what Stig's talking about is the price, the market price that you see the stock is trading for compared to the book value. So whenever you're talking about book value, that's just the assets on the company's books minus the liabilities. That gives you the equity. And that's the book value of the company that he's talking about. So when the price is trading anywhere between 1.2 of the book value, okay, or lower, he's going to buy back shares, is what he said in previous shareholder letters. So that's why he was bringing up that number 1.2 in the discussion there. For anybody else who doesn't know what marketable securities are, that's just stocks, the stocks that he owns in his portfolio. So he owns like 10 or 15% of Coca-Cola, all through publicly traded stock on the stock market. That's what he's talking about when he says marketable securities.
What he also talked about in terms of how do you value a company, what he's basically saying is to make this as accurate as possible. For instance, for Berkshire Hathaway, you will need to take each individual business and then figure out what is the intrinsic value of that, do that for all businesses, and then what is the aggregate of that. But he's saying that is quite one corpus complicated. First of all, it's very subjective because you might not necessarily agree on what it's worth. And also, if you do that as an outsider, it's really hard because that is not disclosed because it's in one corporate structure. So it's actually very hard to do. So what he's saying is, one quick way to look at that would be to look at the book value. And he said it's definitely not an accurate measure. I think no measure really is. And he also says that elsewhere during the meeting. The way he explains is that, if it's a stock, for instance, like Coca-Cola, it will be marked to market. So basically the way it would be recorded is what is traded in the stock market. That's also the value you would see on the books. Whereas other companies, for instance, like Geico, you won't necessarily see how much that's trading at because it's not trading at all. And that is really what the book value is an estimate of. What is it recorded at?
All right, so here's the next question.
Hi, Warren. This one's a fun one. Thomas Kamei is here. He's a 27-year-old shareholder from Kentfield, California. And I should preface the question by saying that he was here 17 years ago, at 10 years old, asked you a question from the audience, asking you if the internet might hurt some of Berkshire's investments. At the time, you said you wanted to see how things would play out. He's now updated the question. What do you think about the implications of artificial intelligence on Berkshire's businesses beyond autonomous driving and Geico, which you've talked about already? In your conversations with Bill Gates, have you thought through which other businesses will be most impacted? And do you think Berkshire's current businesses will have significantly more or less employees a decade from now as a function of artificial intelligence?
I certainly have no special insights on artificial intelligence, but I will bet a lot of things happen in that field in the next couple of decades and probably a shorter time frame. They should lead, I would certainly think, but again, I don't bring much to this party, but I would certainly think they would result in significantly less employment in certain areas, but that's good for society. And it may not be good for a given business, but let's take it to the extreme. Let's assume one person could push a button and essentially, through various machines, robotics, all kinds of things, turn out all of the output we have in this country. So there's just as much output as we have. It's all being done by, instead of 150 some million people being employed, one person. Is the world better off or not? Well, certainly would involve less hours a week of work per week and so on. I mean, it would be a good thing, but it would require enormous transformation in how people relate to each other, what they expect of government, all kinds of things. And of course, as a practical matter, more than one person would keep working. But pushing the idea that way, you'd certainly think that's one of the consequences of making great progress in artificial intelligence. And that's enormously pro-social eventually. It's enormously disruptive in other ways, and it can have huge problems in terms of a democracy and how it reacts to that. It's similar to the problem we have in trade, where trade is beneficial to society, but the people that see the benefits day by day of trade don't see a price at Walmart on socks or whatever they're importing that says you're paying X, but you would pay X plus so many cents if you bought this domestically. So they're getting these small benefits and invisible benefits, and the guy that gets hurt by it, who's the roadkill of free trade, feels it very specifically, and that translates into politics, and it gets very uncertain as to how the world would adjust, in my view, to great increases in productivity. And without knowing a thing about it, I would think that artificial intelligence would have that hugely beneficial social effect, but a very unpredictable political effect if it came in fast, which I think it could. Charlie?
Well, you're painting a very funny world where everybody's engaged in trade, and the trade is I give you golf lessons and you dye my hair. And that would be a world kind of like the royal family of Kuwait or something. And I don't think it would be good for America to have everything produced by one person and the rest of us just engaged in leisure.
How about if we just got twice as productive?
What?
How about if we got twice as productive in a short period of time so that 75 million people could do what 150 million people are doing now?
I think you'd be amazed how quickly people would react to that favorably. That's what happened during the period which everybody remembers with such affection, back in the Eisenhower years, 5% a year or something. People loved it. Nobody complained that they were getting air conditioning and they didn't have it before. Nobody wanted to go back to stinking, sweating nights in the South. And
well, if you cut everybody's hours in half, it's one thing. But if you fire half the people, the other people keep working.
Well, we've adjusted to an enormous amount of it. It just came along a few percent per year.
Well, and the question then is,
I don't think you have to worry about it coming out at 25% a year. I think you have to worry about it. You're going to get less than 2% a year. That's what's worrisome.
Okay, we'll move on. But, it's an absolutely fascinating subject to see what happens with us, but it's very, very hard to predict. If in some way, we've got 36,000 people, say, employed at Geico, and if you could do the same, perform all the same functions, virtually all the same functions even, and do it with 5,000 or 10,000 people, and it came on quickly, and the same thing was happening in a great many other areas. I don't think we've ever experienced anything quite like that, and maybe we won't experience anything like it in the future. I don't know that much about AI, but
I don't think you have to worry about that.
Well, that's because I'm 86.
It's not going to come that quickly.
So for me, this was absolutely positively the most interesting exchange at the meeting, because I mean, what you just heard there is you hear two just total brainiacs kind of sparring between the two of them. And that's not normal. I can tell you, having gone to a few of these meetings, it's not normal to hear these two have a difference of opinion on stage and in front of everybody. And it was pretty awesome to hear where it went. Here's what I find interesting. You can really kind of see how both of them are kind of right in their thinking and how they're going through their thought process. Buffett talking about how basically artificial intelligence and technology is going to continue to have this push towards more productivity in the long run, where humans are going to be losing certain numbers of jobs, but in the grand scheme of things, that's going to make society more productive over time. Where Munger was coming from was much more this macro discussion that Stig and I have so many times on the show, where we're talking about where we don't think interest rates and productivity is going to be very high, if 2% at best, and that we see it going in the way of Japan. And so you kind of saw those two perspectives kind of colliding here. And I found it interesting that once Munger threw that card on the table of like, hey, man, come on, really? Do you think we're going to have more than 2% over the next decade annually? And Buffett immediately, he goes, all right, so next question, because you knew he agreed with Charlie at that point with respect to where he expects the macro factors in the U.S. to kind of go. Like, they both see eye to eye on that. That's my opinion. I don't know for sure, but based on the exchanges that we heard over the meeting, you can see both of these guys kind of feel that the level of productivity that they expect is to be very low. So I don't know where to go with what's right and what's wrong, but I can tell you that this is very, very interesting. And I think it explains how difficult it is to wrap your head around the emergence of technology taking jobs and the macro factors more from a central banking perspective, and all these pressures, these large macro pressures that are in place in order to continue to push interest rates lower. I just find it fascinating to hear these two basically spar and not really have a solution and not really know what to say about either one of the sides of that. Pretty amazing. What did you think, Stig, when you heard this?
Oh, I absolutely loved it. And attending a few meetings myself before, they usually don't have this conversation like in front of 40,000 people. And I think that was really what I enjoyed most about the meeting this year. And I would actually like, again, to talk about productivity, but what is also what they're getting at. And that employment for the sake of employment is probably not good. One argument that Charlie Munger has brought up earlier, this is actually something I have from his book, Poor Charlie's Almanac. And he's talking about creative destruction. And the example he uses is, if you owned a lot of horses in the beginning of the 20th century, you probably wouldn't be too happy with cars coming in, and there would be a lot of people unemployed in the horse business. But still, don't we think today that we were better off because we came up with cars? And that's also what he was talking about in terms of air conditioning. Like, why is it that we invented that? I'm sure that put some people out of job, but overall, we're pretty happy about having air conditioning today. Say that through technology, we wouldn't have sick people. I don't know if that would ever be possible, just for the sake of argument. That would put a lot of doctors out of work, and it would be really bad for pharmaceutical companies. But I would say, as a society, we would be much better off. Now, if we look at what has happened throughout history and whether or not this is good or bad, well, what we can see is that some people will continue educating themselves. And for instance, whenever we went from a transition from being an agricultural society to become a more industrial society, what actually happened was a lot of farmers became manufacturing workers, which is a natural transition because you can be a lot more productive somewhat easily whenever you're entering into that role. Now, what that meant is that when you get more productive, you can also get a higher wage, and you will also increase your living standard as a result of this. So this is good for the people that keep learning, that keep growing themselves, and it's not good for the people who either can or choose not to. So I think that was also something I read between the lines in this discussion.
Very interesting exchange, though. All right, so here's the next question.
Good afternoon. My name is Sally Burns. I'm from Australia, but I currently reside in Austin, Texas. My question, Mr. Buffett, I have heard that Mr. Munger says your greatest talent is that you're a learning machine, that you never stop updating your views. What are the most interesting things you've learned over the last few years?
Well, Charlie is much more of a learning machine than I am. I'm a specialized one, and he does as well as I do in my specialty, and then he's got a much more general absorption rate than I have about what's going on in the world. But, it's a world that gets more fascinating all the time. And a lot of fun can occur when you learn you were wrong on something. That's when you really learn that the old ideas really weren't so correct, and you have to adapt new ones. And that, of course, is difficult. I don't know that I would pick out. Well, I think actually what's going on, in America is terribly, terribly interesting, and politically, all kinds of things. But just the way the world's unfolding, it's moving fast. I do enjoy trying, to figure out not only what's going to happen, but what's even happening now. But I don't think I've got any special insights that would be useful to you. But maybe Charlie does.
I think buying the Apple stock is a good sign in Warren. And now he did run around Omaha and ask if he could take his grandchildren's tablets away. And he did market research. And I do think we keep learning. And more important, we don't unlearn the old tricks. And that is really important. You look at the people who try and solve their problems by printing money and lying and so forth. Take Puerto Rico. Who would have guessed that a territory of the United States would be in bankruptcy? Well, I would have predicted it because they behaved like idiots.
We did not buy any Puerto Rico bonds.
No. You go to Europe, you look at the government bond portfolios we're required to hold in Europe. There's not only no Greek bonds, they're the bonds of nobody but Germany. Everywhere you look in Berkshire, somebody is being sensible. And that is a great pleasure. And you combine that with being very opportunistic so that when something comes along, like a panic, it's like playing with two hands instead of one in a game that requires two hands. It helps to have a fair-sized repertoire. And, Warren, we've learned so damn much. There are all kinds of things we've done in the last 10 years we would not have done 20 years ago.
Yeah, that's true, although it's interesting. I've mentioned this before, but one of the best books on investment was written, I think in 1958. I think I read it around 1960, by Phil Fisher, called Common Stocks and Uncommon Profits. And
all the companies went to hell eventually.
But it talked about the importance, or the usefulness of what he called the scuttlebutt method. And that was something I didn't learn from Graham, but every now and then it's turned out to be very useful. Now, it doesn't solve everything, and there's a whole lot of more.
I saw you do it with American Express and the salad oil scandal.
Yeah.
You're still doing it on Apple, decades later.
Yeah, in certain cases, you actually can learn a lot just by asking a lot of questions. And I give Phil Fisher credit. That book goes back a lot of years. But Charlie said some of the companies he picked as winners forever did sort of peter out on him. But the basic idea, you can learn a lot of things just by asking in some cases. I used to, if I got interested in the coal industry, just say to pick one out of the air, when I was much younger, more energetic, if I went and talked to the heads of 10 coal companies, and I asked each one of them way later into the conversation after they felt like talking, and I would just, I'd just say, if you had to go away for 10 years on a desert island and you had to put all of your family's money into one of your competitors, which one would it be and why? And then, then I'd ask them if they had to sell short one of their competitors for 10 years, all their family money, why? And everybody loves talking about their competitors. And if you do that with 10 different companies, you'll probably have a better fix on the economics of the coal industry than any one of those individuals has. There's ways of getting at things, and sometimes they're useful, sometimes they're not. But sometimes they can be very useful. And, the idea of just learning more all the time about, I'm more specialized than that by far than Charlie. He wants to learn about everything, and I just want to learn about something that will help Berkshire. But it's a very useful attitude toward the world. And, of course, I don't know who said it, but somebody said the problem is not in getting the new ideas, but shedding the old ones. And there's a lot of truth to that.
We would never have bought its car if it had come along 10 years earlier. We would never have bought precision cast parts if it had come along 10 years earlier. We are learning, and my God, we're still learning.
So I don't really have too much to add to this. I think that it's really important for people to hear this and hear how important this aspect of their personality is they just keep on learning. I know we say that so much on the show, but it's such a common theme that we can't play it enough for people.
What Warren was really getting at here was that he said his knowledge is really specialized, and he said that Charlie is much more well-rounded. Anyone reading about Charlie Munger really has to be impressed. I mean, in my book, he's as good as Warren Buffett when it comes to stock picking, but he's also an authority within biology, chemistry, architecture. I mean, name it. Now, he is one of the smartest guys you can find out there.
I just want to add something real fast, Stig. The book that you were talking about earlier, Poor Charlie's Almanac. If you don't have this book, I'm telling you, this book is one of the best books out there, not just on Charlie Munger, but just investing and just general knowledge. You'll feel so much smarter after reading this book because it's just a collage of just important things that every person should know. I can't recommend that book highly enough. It literally sits right next to my lamp, right next to my bed, that book. And so whenever I have a moment, I'll crack it open. I'll read whatever from the book because it's just packed full of knowledge. So sorry to interrupt, Stig. I just want people to know how important that book is.
You know, Preston, we should probably do an episode about it some point in time. Oh my God, it's a great book. So really what I took away from this conversation was whenever Charlie Munger referred to the American Express and the oil-salad scandal, which is such a great story that really tells you about Warren Buffett's approach to investing and actually also what he's been doing with Apple recently. So the story goes like this. So in the late 1950s, US farmers were heavily subsidized, creating a soybean oil surplus. So there was this company here, and it was called Allied Crude Vegetable Oil, and they had this great idea. They would buy up the entire national soybean oil surplus, and you could use that for everything from paint, but also for salad dressing. Now, Allied needed a lot of capital to make this happen, and they got that from American Express. Now, the problem was that it turned out that they never bought all that oil and was all a big scam. Basically, the company duped investors by filling its tankers with water and just a few feet of oil. Now, as you might know, since oil floats above water, it simply appeared to the port inspectors that the ships were indeed loaded with oil. Now, American Express really took a huge hit on this because they stored the oil, or it was mainly water, but they stored the goods, they expected it, and they also vouched for it. And they were even used as a collateral for the bank loans. Now, whenever the scandal was revealed, American Express stock dropped 50%. And there were actually a lot of people who feared that the company might eventually go bankrupt. Now, Warren Buffett read through financial statements, and what he realized was that it was probably not as bad. I mean, short term, yes, it was bad. But what he realized after actually sitting at a restaurant and watching all people still using American Express credit cards was that it really raised the question whether or not the fundamentals of the company was changed. So as the legend goes, he actually sat down through an entire day at the counter. So he just went out there to the clerk and asked, can I just sit here and look at the receipts and how many people are still paying with American Express? And he was allowed to do that. So what he actually realized is that even though the company did a really bad job with due diligence, the core business still thrived, and credit cards will always be needed. So what he actually did in return was he put 40% of his partners' portfolios back then into American Express, which turned out to be one of his most profitable investments. So what Charlie Munger is talking about here is that he did it before, and now he's doing it again with what's called the Skullbot method, when you are not only looking at financial statements, but also seeing how much information you can compile about the core product itself. And he used this silly example with trying to take a tablet away from his grandkids, but I'm sure he's been doing other research as well. And I think it really tells you about how much Warren Buffett is still learning, even though he's age 86.
Something that I really like in that exchange that you're talking about, Stig, is just how intelligent he asks questions. So whenever he was describing how the coal industry, he would go and talk to the top 10 coal industry and how he was phrasing the question. If you had to go away for 10 years and you could only pick the best competitor to put your family's money in, which one would it be? Asking such an intelligently crafted question can unveil so much knowledge and so much information if you just pinpoint the right way to ask it, opposed to some just stupid question that gets down in the weeds and doesn't get to the heart of the issue. And so for me, that was something that I really liked about that exchange, is how poignant a great question can be at uncovering information that you're really trying to understand. So, okay, let's play the last question. This is our last one from the meeting that we extracted that we think was well worth everyone's time. So I hope you guys have enjoyed these questions, and this is the last one we got for you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Munger and Mr. Buffett. My name is Ji Wenyan. I'm come from China. It's my first time to come to this meeting, and I think I'm very lucky to have a chance to ask a question.
We're glad to have you.
Thank you. Everyone has personal dreams, and at different ages, maybe dreams will come differently. What's your dream now?
My dream? Well,
let's skip the first one.
sometime when I'm especially wishful, I think, oh, to be 90 again. And I got some advice for the young. If you got anything you really want to do, don't wait till you're 93.
I'll do it. Oh, that's the same thing I would tell students, is that you can't always find it the first time or the second time, but when you go out in the world, look for the job that you would take if you didn't need a job. I mean, don't postpone that sort of thing. Somebody, I think it was Kierkegaard, said that, life must be evaluated backwards, but it must be lived forwards. And you want to sort of, Charlie says all he wants to know is where he'll die, so he'll never go there. And so you do want to do a certain amount of reverse engineering in life. I mean, that doesn't mean you can do everything that way, but you really want to think about what will make you feel good when you get older about your life, and you at least generally want to keep going in that direction. And you need some luck in life, and you got to accept some bad things that are going to happen as you go along. But life has been awfully good to me and Charlie, so we have no complaints.
What you don't want to be is like the man, and they have his funeral, and the minister said, now it's the time for somebody to say something nice about the deceased. And nobody came forward. He said, surely somebody can say something nice about the deceased. And nobody came forward. And finally, one man came up and he said, his brother was worse.
Yep.
Oh, my God. I love these two. It's hard to have more fun than that. I don't really have anything to comment other than what an awesome exchange. And the other thing I like about listening to these two is the humor is so subtle. It is so subtle, just like Buffett's comment. He goes, well, let's just skip your first dream and go right to your second one. I mean, that is just so clever and hilarious. It's just a blast. So, Stig, did you have any comments on the last one? I think it was more for the humor of the audience.
It was really a lot of fun, and one of the jokes that they were just spewing out jokes like all the time, but one of my favorites was at the very beginning where they introduced Jack Bogle, and they said, here's Jack Bogle, and he's 88. And then Buffett just said, in just 2 years, Jack, you'll be eligible for an executive position at Berkshire Hathaway. And then Munger would just say, just like that, hang in there, buddy, you'll get there. I mean, how funny is that?
Oh, yeah. It's so much fun. I'm telling you, if you've never gone to this meeting, these two are getting old. You've got to make it out to this meeting. I'm telling you, it is so worth your time. If you're trying to mark it on your calendar, around Christmas time is when you need to start planning to go to this thing. And it's always, usually the first weekend of May is when the meeting is. And we'll obviously be going next year. We will also be putting information out there for if people want to attend the meeting with us. We try to make it as user-friendly as possible so people can attend and not have to worry about the logistics and all the craziness of getting your credentials. We try to make that as easy as possible and help people along the way. And we have a forum where the community can help one another. So we would love to have you. If you're listening to this, we'd love to have you with us next year when we go out. This year we had about 150 people and we had a blast. We had so much fun. So,
all right, guys. So I'll definitely say that Preston and I, we thoroughly enjoy recording all episodes, but I think the Berkshire episode, it's really something special for us. We just, you can probably hear then how excited we are whenever we talk about it. It's just so much fun. But guys, that was all that Preston and I had for this week's episode of the Investors Podcast. We see each other again next week.
Thanks for listening to TIP. To access the show notes, courses, or forums, go to theinvestorspodcast.com. To get your questions played on the show, go to asktheinvestors.com and win a free subscription to any of our courses on TIP Academy. This show is for entertainment purposes only. Before making investment decisions, consult a professional. This show is copyrighted by the TIP Network. Written permission must be granted before syndication or rebroadcasting.
TIP.